It wasn't a monster. It was a ghost. For 3 months, the crew of the deep-sea research vessel Vanguard had been mowing the lawn, meticulously tracing a grid over a patch of the Pacific Ocean so desolate it made the moon look crowded. Their target was an anomaly, a whisper detected by their autonomous underwater vehicle, AUV Hugin, 100 miles shy of Howland Island. It was a faint, plane-shaped shadow on the seabed, captured by Deep Sea Vision's DSV team a year prior, an image that had electrified the archaeological world and been dismissed by skeptics as just another basalt rock. But DSV's CEO, Tony Romeo, a former Air Force intelligence officer, had staked his reputation and millions of dollars on that shadow. Now, leading the confirmation expedition, he stared at the monitors in the Vanguard's darkened control room. It was 3 a.m., and 16,500 feet below them, the remotely operated vehicle, ROV Hercules, was finally on the bottom. "Bring us in slow." Romeo's voice was a low rasp, thick with exhaustion and adrenaline. "Pan left." "There." At first there was nothing, just the endless gray-brown ooze of the abyssal plain, a graveyard of microscopic shells. Then the Hercules' powerful LED spotlights caught something. Not rock. Rock didn't have rivets. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. A wing sheared off at the root, lay half buried in the silt. It was unmistakably aluminum, ghostly pale under the lights. The ROV glided forward, its thrusters humming faintly through the hydrophones. It moved past a mangled Pratt & Whitney Wasp engine, its propeller blades bent back like a dead flower. And then they saw it. The fuselage. It was broken, fractured just behind the main cabin, but the iconic twin-tailed shape was undeniable. The ROV's manipulator arm, delicate as a surgeon's hand, extended and brushed away 88 years of accumulated sediment from the tail fin. Faintly under the marine growth, the paint held. NR160200. A technician began to weep quietly. Another simply removed his headset and walked out of the room. Tony Romeo leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and put a hand over his face. The ghost had a name. After 88 years, 2 months, and 19 days, the world's most profound aviation mystery was over. They had found Amelia Earhart. To understand the miracle of the discovery, you must first understand the impossibility of the flight. It was July 2nd, 1937. Amelia Earhart, the world's sweetheart, America's first lady of the air, was not just a pilot. She was an icon, a living symbol of daring and female emancipation. She was 39 years old, weathered by the sun, and driven by a relentless need to push the horizon. At her side was Fred Noonan, 44, arguably the greatest aerial navigator of his generation. He was a man who could find a pinpoint of land in a universe of water using only a clock, a sextant, and the stars. Their aircraft was the Flying Laboratory, an $80,000 Lockheed Electra 10E, modified for one purpose: to circumnavigate the globe at its widest point, the equator. They had already flown 22,000 miles, a grueling journey from Oakland to Miami, across the Atlantic, over Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Now only the vast, empty Pacific remained. The leg from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island was the most dangerous of the entire journey. Howland Island was not an island. It was a mistake. A sliver of coral and sand, 2 miles long and half a mile wide, rising just 20 feet above the waves. It was an uninhabited speck, 2,556 miles from Lae, a distance that pushed the Electra to the absolute limit of its fuel capacity. Finding it in 1937 was, as one pilot put it, like trying to find a specific postage stamp in a football stadium at night during a storm with your eyes half closed. Earhart and Noonan were exhausted. They took off from Leh at 10 a.m. local time, the Electra heavy with 1,100 gallons of fuel. They climbed into a sky thick with tropical clouds. This was the first domino to fall. Noonan was a master of celestial navigation, but without a clear view of the sun by day or the stars by night, his sextant was useless. He would have to rely on dead reckoning, calculating their position based on speed, time, and compass heading, all while factoring in the notoriously fickle winds of the intertropical convergence zone. Waiting for them at Howland Island was the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca. Its crew was tense. Their job was to act as a radio beacon, but the radio technology was tragically primitive. Earhart's Electra was equipped with a new Bendix radio direction finder, RDF, but she was famously uncomfortable with its complex operation. More critically, the Itasca and the Electra were operating on mismatched frequencies. The Itasca could transmit voice on 7,500 kilohertz, but Earhart's RDF equipment was designed to home in on a different band. It was a fatal technical mismatch. For 18 hours, they flew into the void. Then, as dawn broke on July 2nd, the Itasca's radio room crackled to life. It was her voice, high, clear, and laced with the first hint of static and fear. KHAQQ calling Itasca. We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low. Been unable to reach you by radio. The Itasca's radio man, Leo Bellartz, transmitted frantically, sending a steady stream of A's in Morse code for her to home in on. He asked her to hold her microphone key down so they could get a bearing on her. She did, but only for a few seconds, not long enough. She could hear them, but they couldn't get a fix on her, and she couldn't get a fix on them. The radio transmissions became a heartbreaking monologue of mounting panic. At 7:42 a.m., we must be on you, but cannot see you. Gas is running low. We are flying at 1,000 feet. The Itasca's crew standing on deck scanned the horizon. The weather was clear, but the ocean was empty. They ordered the ship's boiler to be fired, sending a thick black column of smoke into the sky as a visual signal. At 8:43 a.m., the last, desperate transmission came through. Her voice was strong, almost frantic but clear. We are on the line 157337. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6210 kilohertz. Wait.
The line 157337 was Noonan's sun line, a line of position he had managed to calculate from a brief glimpse of the rising sun. It meant they were somewhere on that line, which ran northwest to southeast. But were they north or south of Howland? They were blind. Then, just one more phrase, "We are running north and south." And then silence. The radio went dead. Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan, and the silver Electra had vanished, as if plucked from the sky. The search that followed was the largest in naval history at the time. The U.S. Navy and Coast Guard scoured 250,000 square miles of ocean. President Roosevelt himself authorized the search, which involved 66 aircraft and 9 ships, including the battleship USS Colorado. They found nothing. Not a scrap of metal, not an oil slick, not a life vest. The mystery metastasized. It became America's greatest obsession. Theories bloomed in the vacuum of facts. She was a spy captured and executed by the Japanese. She was living on a remote island as a castaway, the Niku theory. She had secretly returned to the U.S. and was living as a New Jersey housewife named Irene Bolam. The mystery of her disappearance became more famous than the achievements of her life. For 88 years, she remained lost. The Vanguard's control room was now a scientific sanctuary. The The discovery was too profound for celebration. It was a moment of deep historical reverence. "The location," said Dr. Kenna Harrison, the expedition's chief archaeologist, "is the first clue. They are 97 nautical miles west-northwest of Howland. This changes the entire narrative. For decades, the leading theory, championed by groups like TIGAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, was that Earhart and Noonan had missed Howland, turned south along their 157-337 sunline, and crash-landed on the reef of Nikomororo, 350 miles away. There they had supposedly survived for days, sending out faint radio signals, before being washed away by the tide. It was a romantic, Robinson Crusoe-esque story. The wreckage on the seabed told a different, colder, and far more sudden story. "They never made it to Nikomororo," Romeo said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "They never made it to Nikomororo. They were never castaways." The Hercules' high-definition cameras performed a meticulous photogrammetry scan, building a 3D model of the wreck site. The evidence painted a grim, clear picture of the Electra's final moments. The port engine was torn from its mounting. The starboard wing was gone, sheared clean off. The fuselage itself was pancaked, consistent with a high-velocity impact with the water. This was not a controlled ditching. A ditching, even a failed one, would have left the wings more or less intact, as the pilot would have stalled the plane just above the waves. "Look at the propeller," Harrison pointed. "The blades aren't feathered. They were running. The engines were under power when she hit." This was the key. They hadn't simply run out of fuel and glided into the sea. The team began to piece together the 88-year-old puzzle. Earhart and Noonan, realizing they had missed Howland, had turned onto their line 157-337. In her final transmission, she said, "We are running north and south." This meant she was flying along that line, searching desperately for the island. The location of the wreck, northwest of Howland, suggested they had made a terrible but understandable calculation. Believing the Itasca's radio signals were strong, they must have assumed they had overflown the island. They had likely turned back northwest, retracing their path, thinking they had gone too far. They were lost, flying in circles, burning the last of their fuel. "She was an aggressive pilot," Romeo murmured. "She wouldn't have just given up and ditched. She would have flown it until the tanks were dry." The team's consensus was chilling. The Electra's engines likely sputtered and died, one after the other. With no power, the heavy aircraft would have stalled almost immediately. It would have dropped from the sky like a brick, as one pilot described it, entering an uncontrolled spin, and it would have hit the water at over 100 miles per hour, disintegrating on impact and sinking in less than 10 minutes. Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were likely killed instantly. Their end was not a lingering tragedy on a deserted beach. It was a sudden, violent, and mercifully quick conclusion in the vast, indifferent ocean. The Hercules cameras performed a 30-hour survey mission. They did not recover anything. This was an archaeological site, a grave. Its mission was only to document, to confirm, and to finally bear witness. On its final pass, the ROV Hercules hovered over the fractured cockpit. The glass was long gone. Inside was a dark void, filled with silt and the patient deep-sea creatures that had colonized the wreck. It was a silent tomb. The team on the Vanguard observed a moment of silence, a broadcast of pure, unbroken quiet sent down 16,500 feet to the two aviators who had been alone for so long. When the Vanguard docked in Honolulu 2 weeks later, the world was waiting. The news had been kept under a total embargo, but the rumor mill was churning. When Tony Romeo stepped onto the dock,
his face grim but set, and walked to the podium. The flashbulbs were blinding. "For 88 years," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan have been symbols of a great mystery. Today, they are symbols of a great truth. We have found them." The announcement detonated across the globe. It was the end of an era of speculation. The mystery that had defined a generation and launched 1,000 quests was at last solved. For America, it was the closing of a painful chapter. Amelia was more than just a pilot. She was the bright, fearless embodiment of the American spirit in the dark days of the Great Depression. She was the woman who had proven that the sky belonged to everyone. Her loss was a national trauma, a question mark seared into the country's psyche. The search for Amelia Earhart was never just about finding a plane. It was about a cultural need for closure, a desire to finish the journey she started. With the discovery of NR 16020 resting peacefully in the abyssal silence, that journey was finally complete. The ghost of the Pacific had been given its name, and Amelia and Fred had at last been brought home.